I'd like to take this moment too to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, but I also like at the same time to pay my respects to those traditional custodians of the land that our family have the privilege of farming in Western Australia. We've been very blessed to have that opportunity to farm a large area over there, and we're constantly amazed at what it's able to teach us and what we can learn from it. So we've been very thrilled to have that opportunity. We've got a family farm in the central wheatbelt of Western Australia. We started off in 1994 with 660 hectares that Ian and I purchased ourselves. We weren't lucky enough to inherit any land, even though we're both from farming families. And we've grown that farming enterprise to now we're farming 13,000 hectares in the central wheatbelt. But in that time frame from 1994 through to now, we've actually had the privilege of working either livestock or cropping over 40,000 hectares. So that's been via leasing, share farming, purchased some land, all sorts of bits and pieces. But what's effectively done is given us a huge opportunity for learning, looking at landscape, looking at how the livestock in particular respond to different landscapes. And some of those landscapes are what you call the blue chip country, where there's magnificent rainfall and they put their high inputs on and grow wonderful crops and pastures, but the livestock used to go there and not perform very well at all. And we bring them back to our low rainfall zone with a bit of dust if they're lucky, and they would just be blooming in their health and gaining lots of weight. Annually we probably produce around 6,000 to 7,000 tonne of grain, wheat, barley, oats, triticale, pasture-fed lamb, mutton and wool. Just an example of our rainfall patterns. In the 90s, the average rainfall was around about 300 mil per annum, but since 2000 it fell off a cliff a bit and it's been averaging around the 200 mil per annum. And just a bit of an overview of Western Australia. The top picture is actually a farm we've taken on in 2014, and it was a paddock amongst many that looked as bad as that. And the bottom one is, I see Charles had the same picture, obviously meant something to both of us, but an indicator of some of the land in Western Australia. So obviously when that land was cleared and established, it was a magnificent piece of country with the remnants of the tree vegetation there. And that fence isn't that particularly old by the look of the way that timber's cut. So to think of the degradation that has come to achieve that in probably 60 years maybe, is pretty scary. But there's been a lot of overclearing in Western Australia, and it's resulted in lots of salinisation, acidification of soils through poor management, compaction of those soils and loss of soil structure, and consequently very poor infiltration rates for the water, loss of biodiversity on top and under the ground. And as a result of those broken water cycles, lots of desertification. But there is a really positive solution. We can restore our ecosystems with plants and animals, and that's been a very exciting journey for us as a family, and we're looking forward to having a long future of continuing to do that. What I'm talking about today is what we call natural intelligence agriculture, and I guess it's something a few words we've put together to try and describe what we've been doing on our farm. Because it's probably been a real case of stepping back and letting those natural systems work. When we first started changing our thinking, we thought of ourselves as biological farmers, but as we got into it, we realised, that probably still was indicating that the human was making a fair bit of the decision making and being fairly diagnostic and prescriptive in the decision making. And we realised that no, really we weren't the drivers of it. Mother Nature had it sorted, and it was just really a case of enabling those processes to happen as best possible within a modern agricultural system. So the natural intelligences we focus on are those of seed intelligence and the microbial intelligence within the soil, the complexity of those microbial populations and how they all work and communicate together. And then with the seed, as it puts its root into the ground, and the association between the soil microbes and the plant. The animal intelligence, that innate wisdom that Charles was talking about, of the animals and their grazing patterns, their understanding of how to select appropriate nutrients for their health, but also to maintain an appropriate rumen health for supporting the diversity of microbes within their gut that are part of the environment on which they graze, so cycling that as well. And of course it's all powered by photosynthesis and water, which we need fairly desperately a lot of the time in Western Australia. And I forgot the CO2, Walter, so I'm very remiss there. So we'll go over the key principles of what we call natural intelligence agriculture. One of the key ones, I guess, has been restoring the indigenous microbial population. So one of the first steps we've been doing there is replacing synthetic fertilisers with natural fertility processes. So instead of using your NPK fertilisers, we've dropped them out completely and use a worm digestion liquid concentrate, and no prizes for guessing what that might be, and compost extract, and then of course, as Walter was talking about, those biodigesters on legs, which is our sheep, and with their appropriate microbes in their gut, transporting that around the farmers, from whether it be out of native bushland onto the farming paddocks, and supporting that throughout all the properties. So restoring the soil microbiome, one of the key things we do is we put the worm liquid directly onto the cereal grains as a seed dressing prior to sowing. So this provides not only a microbial support, but a lot of other activities that come through the digestive process of worm activity, which I'm certainly not a full bottle on. But what it does for us, in our mind, is that it stimulates those native microbes to feel that this is a fairly good, positive environment to be part of, and they get onto that seed very quickly as that root's emerging. The seed there, you see this, I don't know which is left or right, but with the most root growth and rhizosheath development there is ours, and it hasn't actually reached the soil surface yet to start photosynthesising. And the seedling on the other side of the matchbox is the neighbour's, and his has actually got out to start photosynthesising. But you can see there the difference between what those two different seeds have decided is the best thing to do as far as promoting what was required for that environment. So one's developing a far superior root structure with a far greater, width to its rhizosheath, already starting to form some soil aggregates around the root, so doing a fantastic job to try and rejuvenate that piece of soil. Bear in mind, these photographs were taken on a farm that we've only, that particular one, been farming for 4 years, and it's a very seriously compacted property with a fairly sandy soil type, and the plants know what needs to be done to get that property going forward. And I guess, of course, once you're getting those kind of rhizosheath developments, then you've got true potential there for the liquid carbon pathway to occur. So it really is all about having that appropriate microbial interface between the plant root and the soil, so that that carbon sequestration can occur at depth in the soil. And as a result of that, as Walter was mentioning too, the capacity then of that microbial sheath to prevent the uptake of toxins into the plant. So as a result of that, and also the opportunity to build the immune system of that plant through appropriate access to nutrient, we don't need to use any pesticides or fungicides because of the immune system function. And under the microscope, so what we can see with the naked eye is far more brilliant under a microscope, and we're very lucky to have a very kind gentleman in Western Australia by the name of Mr. Phil Lee, who has been very patient with me, taking lots of photographs of some of these rhizosheaths to see what's going on. And this was one of my favourite because it had not only the soil aggregation around the root, but just all the evidence of the fungal hyphae got me pretty excited, and got Phil pretty excited too, which was lovely. But to be able to see that with your, you can't see it otherwise, was just an amazing opportunity. And then I had to go and put this one on, Walter, after hearing about your pieces of nothing. I thought, well, I've got some bits of nothing out there, because Phil had talked about it with the soil samples and the rhizosheath with the aggregation and the air spaces occurring. So I thought I'd better put my pictures of nothing up there too. Our seed treatment system's pretty basic, but I've realised now that this is a pretty old hat too. That picture's probably about 10 years old, because now what we do is we just put a 1,000 litre shuttle of the stuff, stick a bilge pump in it and put it up the auger as the seed's going up into the truck, and we put it on as wet as we possibly can get, so it's virtually dripping off the seed. Gets a really good coating. We have a liquid inject system, which we put the worm liquid and the compost extract on as the fertility down with the seed as well. And then foliar spray, so just to protect the leaf later on, and just to add to the whole scenario, I guess, for that year's growing. And it does seem to help with further disease prevention if there is a big disease year throughout the district. An example of then the plants as they're getting a bit older and how they go about restoring the soil. On the one picture where there's two hands there holding a wheat plant and a radish plant, these were both dug out on the same shovel full of dirt in a paddock that we've only been cropping. It was the second year crop into that paddock, we hadn't had any previous history with it. But you can see very clearly that that wheat plant has a phenomenal root structure. It's obviously hit either a compaction layer or an acid layer not too deep down into the soil. The soil there is about 4.5 pH at the surface to about 4 pH at about 10 to 15 centimetres down. So you can see it's having a bit of trouble, but it's actually pushing through those layers and going to be making a good job for creating water pathways for into the future and the opportunity for restoring that soil structure for the following year's crop or whatever might be growing there. And the other soil profile picture there, we had Nicole Masters come on farm and she wanted us to dig some soil pits, and we did a couple, one in the wadgel soil, which is a very high aluminium, low pH soil, highly compacted, and I think I was having a fair job getting into it with a telehandler. So we only dug that far thinking, oh, well, that'd be ample. But unfortunately, the roots were right to the bottom of that pit, which you wouldn't have expected, given the pH that it was, and with the obvious compaction that you can see. So if we had have dug a bit deeper, we might have even been more pleasantly surprised. But you can see clearly at the top there just what a fabulous job those plants have done in restoring some soil structure to that top layer of soil, and changing the colour and all that kind of thing. Animals restoring soil, I guess this is my pet subject because I tend to monitor the animals the most, me and the 3 dogs. But what's been really exciting is probably about 18 years ago we stopped drenching the sheep and stopped feeding grain. And so we're really able to then allow the animals to use their innate wisdom to select foodstuffs, and by changing their reliance on grains and not disturbing the gut microflora through drenching and all those kind of things, the gut microbes able to be part of that environment, and the animals now can digest some fairly rough foodstuffs out there as we go onto new farms. That animals are the first things that go on there to start transforming that land. But I just loved seeing this manure when I was digging around in the paddock and just seeing the fungi wrapped around it, and I thought, well, that's obviously a key indicator that manure is right on target for that fungus diet, thinking they're at a 5-star restaurant, and I was pretty thrilled about that. But one of the keys that we feel on our farm is that we don't just use any old animals, we have a self-replacing flock, because we feel that's really important in the ability of those mothers to be able to pass on their innate ancient wisdom to their progeny, knowing how to select the right foodstuffs, knowing how to graze a property appropriately, so that you continue that ongoing progressive cycle of improvement through their passed on knowledge. So I guess there's been quite a number of different outcomes with on-farm, local and global outcomes. Firstly, I guess on-farm is actually being able to rebuild the sponge in the soil. So rebuilding a soil that's able to allow the water to infiltrate. You can see amongst that root sample there's water or air pores there, evidence of soil aggregates forming, and a fairly significant root mass that was fairly dry, that soil, when we dug it up, so we couldn't get terribly deep, but very wide root mass there. We had some deep soil testing done with an independent tester under the SCARP protocol that was set up by CSIRO. Anyway, they compared our soil with the same soil type on the neighbouring property, which was a conventional farm following best practice. And they found that the carbon increase on our farm was a bit over 10 tonne to the hectare, greater than that on the neighbour's farm. Interestingly, the deeper they went into the soil, the greater the difference. So we were actually really able to demonstrate then liquid carbon pathway happening and the carbon being deposited deep into the soil. It was pretty exciting too to see the associated increase in nitrogen there as well. We'd had a continuous cereal program on those paddocks prior to that testing, whereas the neighbour had a legume phase just only 12 months prior. And we had significantly greater levels of nitrogen in that soil, which was certainly against what you would expect with that kind of a history. And they only tested the water holding capacity in the top 10 centimetres, but even that was 13% higher. So you can imagine as you went at depth, when the comparison between the soil carbon levels were even greater, that the water holding capacity at depth would have been even more significant than that. One of the farms we had at Darren, south of Darren, bit of the beach sand type of country, and just showing there that even though a soil test would say this soil needs lots of nitrogen, lots of potassium to grow anything, we just used a bit of worm liquid compost extract and only 2.5 units of N and had a crop looking like that, which is a fairly robust colour, robust growth, and you certainly wouldn't have expected that with that soil type. On a similar property in the same sort of area, we've been farming this one for 7 years and it had some summer rain at the end just as we were about to finish off, and just show the difference between that and the neighbour. The potential there on our side of having that year-round carbon sequestration with the green cover and restoring the small water cycles there, but the significant wind erosion risk of the neighbours on the other side and obvious soil health decline. Just another example there too. What was interesting, and this is with the whole soil progression, changing soil ecology, is just the plants that start to come or don't come as that soil health progresses, because it was exactly the same soil type and same rainfall on these two paddocks, but what came up on the neighbours was radish and melons. So of course he went out and sprayed them for the summer, whereas we had some lovely sheep feed, and there was no melons to be worried about, or radish or anything that would be termed a weed, although we wouldn't have been worried about the radish anyway, so the sheep would have eaten it anyhow. But another example of that too is some of the other weeds that don't come up. A really bad weed in Western Australia for livestock production is caltrop, which is quite toxic. And the farm that we took on in 2014 had a big burden of this, and we had a couple of summer rainfalls and a lot of it came up. In the first year it was very toxic to the livestock and fairly prolific. It was almost a carpet, not the kind of carpet you'd really want of green cover, but anyway. And we did lose some lambs, but the second year when we had the same sort of rainfall event, the same type of sheep, so young lambs, didn't have the problems as much with them. We didn't lose any. The ewes have been able to graze on that, and it doesn't seem to affect the ewes so much. So, there could have been that capacity there from being passed on from the ewe to the lamb, but just the fact that there was less of those caltrop weeds coming up, less melons, less of those problem plants. And then we come to what happened this last summer on the same property as the native grasses coming back, which has been really exciting. So to see them in that density, and we had about 4,500 acres of this Pastoral came up, and there was also other, about 4 or 5 other varieties of summer grass came up on those paddocks, and it was something that was really amazing for us, because when we first came across Cole Seiss and his pasture cropping, and we looked at his environment, we thought, gee, how on earth is this going to really, kick off in Western Australia? It's so dry, and compared to Cole's place, and we didn't even know if the seed population was going to be there, because it was very rare that you would see much in the way of native grasses around large areas of Western Australia. And yeah, this really enheartened us. We had seen certainly other summer grasses at home, and the Albini farm with windmill grass and things like that coming back quite prolifically, but this is the first time we've seen this level of Pastoral coming back. And restoring other biodiversity with the native wildflowers and things coming into the paddock. And that little grass on the bottom corner there was one that used to be through the pastoral areas in Western Australia and probably hasn't been seen for several generations. So one of the other key principles, I guess, of natural intelligence agriculture is being fluid in your capacity to interact with what's going on, because one thing's for sure, everything's changing the whole time. And I guess that's part of the excitement of it all as well, because you are learning something all the time. And what you might know today might be completely wrong the next week or next year, because you might have learned or moved on from that. And that is the fluidity of those natural systems as they progress and continue, I guess, as Charles would say, self-organise. It is a constantly moving target, but one that's constantly amazing at the same time. And I really liked the quote that Charlie had put in the book, and I'd like to just read it out because I thought it was exactly what I was trying to think of, was the challenge we face is to avoid illusions of stability, control and permanence, and to embrace inexorable cycles of transformation. And I guess that's where it becomes a different process to what the conventional system has been, in that mechanical mind is very controlling, wanting things to be predictable and reliable. And certainly in a natural system it's way beyond that, but it's so much more exciting because the potentials that it unveils over time are just far beyond perhaps even our original comprehension might be. And another point I'd like to make too is that your eyes don't always tell the truth, and we've got to be really aware of that, because particularly in the conventional system a crop can be full of urea and fungicide and look magnificent colour and magnificent plants, but obviously still very, very sick. And if you analyse those plants, their nutrient diversity and density and so forth, they're just not what they appear to be. And I guess it can be the same too with animals that are fat, as opposed to ones that are fed on pasture. A fat animal out of a feedlot might look okay, but it's certainly a completely different being when you get it as a food source and the health of that animal in itself. Another really important part is just your intent as a farmer and your engagement in the paddock, so being out in the paddock. I think that's one of the traps with where farming's heading conventionally now, is perhaps the reliance on artificial intelligence and the farmer being removed from the paddock and into the office more. And I think it's really that opportunity that we have that we've got to really treasure, is being able to get out with nature regularly. And I think that's part of what the previous fella's health improvements assessment might have been, for the opportunity for farmers practicing regenerative agriculture, being out engaged in an improving environment and ecosystem, because effectively we are at one with that ecosystem. We're totally interconnected with it in all manner, and yeah, that's something we just have to appreciate. And just trusting nature, that nature's really got it sorted, and that we can just go along with that quite happily, and will reduce those stress levels over time once you get your head around realising that you aren't the boss. Transformation at a local level, so seeing agricultural practice across large areas like the wheatbelt changing, so that we can have some positive change. Because my dream is that one day we can get on top of salinity and reverse that in Western Australia, because it is a creeping death. The state governments are very concerned because it's starting to annihilate some infrastructure and roads and things, and going to be a very costly problem into the future. The Auditor General is predicting that 80% of land in Western Australia in the wheatbelt needs to be revegetated to control salinity. We've got to look at food production and agriculture being maintained at the same time, so we have to come up with some pretty significant solutions pretty pronto. And I think partly that land that we've just taken on recently has shown us lots of those potentials, because there's significant salinity issues on that property. And the last summer we saw, as we were saying, a lot of that native grasses were coming up on salt-tolerant, salt-affected areas, and just showing us that potential with having the appropriate soil microbes in there that can help detoxify some of the salinity and enable perhaps that water cycle to restore and change the whole process, that it really is a reality that we can get on top of salinity. Something else we've done too is salt bush plantings, and I guess that not only helps with the salinity but also providing that haystack in the paddock for the rough starts to the season, having a perennial shrub as opposed to a perennial grass, which is probably a little bit more susceptible to drier seasons. We host different events on farm at times and help, along with Rochelle from Soil Restoration Farming, bringing different scientists to Western Australia, which has been wonderful to help educate other farmers, and just getting them out in the paddock just to see that some of these things that we thought were real, perhaps, and that we've been taught many years before, could be challenged and there could be alternatives. And we've also formed a small group at this point in time, biointegrity growers, where we're trying to get together farmers that are producing under the same sort of production system and get our food sources together and market that as an appropriate food into the marketplace. Then we get into restoring communities by enabling, some of that profit being back to farmers once we pull this food market off. More of the profit going back to the farmers rather than the middleman all the time, and help replenishing inspiration into communities for families to remain. Pulling it all together, then leading onto the global transformation path. There's lots of things that we can look at, and Walter's given us a very clear indicator that there's that whole soil petogenesis thing, and we've been looking at epigenetics along the lines that Charlie was talking about in some of those changes in how you can respond with appropriate nutrition and appropriate microbial interface within our own gut, and how that can reflect in chronic disease development. Some of the science that we've been looking at recently is just indicating that the bacteria that's in our soil can communicate with the bacteria in our gut via the food. So it's fairly phenomenal information. But it seems to be that it's not only just through the gut, it's through our respiratory system as well. And they're talking about the air that you breathe it being just as important as the food that you're eating as well, and recommending that you get out into fresh environments to breathe in the appropriate microbes, I guess. So going bush is a good thing. And some of these interactions between the microbes are instant. So you can, if you need to eat an appropriate food stuff that's rich in good nutrition with secondary compounds and polynutrients or whatever it's called. I don't know all the words, Walter, but anyway, there's lots of things there that have a direct influence on how the quality of that food is and how it responds in your system. So as Charlie was talking earlier, it's just one of those reasons as why it's important for us to work towards reduction and elimination of chemicals in food production. Quite a large area of our crop this year went in under a no-kill cropping, similar to what Bruce Maynard talks about. And so that's been exciting too, to see the property put itself into a situation of health where the weeds aren't impacting upon your cropping program. And also just that the soil and gut microbes are our only means of detoxifying these things from our environment and our diet. So we really have to focus on them, because they really are our only true future if we're wanting to have any level of health as well as environmental health. I've put together what I call a positive epigenetic spiral, but it could be the same thing with a soil petogenesis spiral, because at the end of the day it's the same message. By working on helping to restore soil microbial integrity and diversity, that has the impact, as Walter was saying, onto the plants that are growing there, and then that can impact the animals that graze that, and then I guess the byproducts of their interaction then helps to continue the further development of the soil progression. And then of course as us as consumers of the plants and the animals from that land get the positive health benefits from that as well, and a beautiful spin-off as well as the improved global and environmental health up the top. So we can constantly keep working ourselves up in a positive fashion rather than the current state where we're winding ourselves down in the other direction. So some of the keys to promoting positive epigenetic outcomes on farm, other than the self-replacing livestock, is saving your own seed. And I just wanted to demonstrate with these photographs of a seedling that ours, which has got the larger root structure, was 36 hours old when I dug it up. And not being the brightest match in the pack, I didn't think about getting over the neighbour's fence that day, so I did it a couple of days later. So the neighbour's seedling was 60 hours old, but you can see clearly the difference there. So not only was there a seed dressing difference, but what I was trying to implicate was the actual seed itself. So the seed had made the choice of wanting to develop roots as opposed to, and at a greater speed than what the neighbours was able to. So yeah, just that whole thing of that being able to keep that seed and the seed's awareness of the environment that it's growing in and what it needs to do. Producing premium food, and as Walt was talking about, we get a lot of positive spin-offs from improving the soil health along the line of enabling that premium food to be attained. We have actually had our grains tested by 2 different independent labs and been able to demonstrate them being free of all pesticides, all fungicides, all mycotoxins, glyphosate and heavy metals. So fairly significant when you think at the moment of the number of chemicals that are water soluble in the atmosphere, able to be moved through dust or whatever it might be, so that even organic farms can't necessarily claim to be free unless they actually physically test for those things now. Given that there's glyphosate in the Antarctic regions, well, it's going to be falling as rain on all parts of the land surface. Into the meat, and I think for those of you who haven't read Charles's book, he does talk about that really well with looking at the benefits of the animals grazing the appropriately grown plants, and even into the low rainfall areas where the secondary compounds are more prolific in the plants, which then impacts directly on the health of those animals and onto the health of the humans that are able to consume it. And the other product, I guess, from running sheep is wool, which at the moment, fortunately, is a fairly worthwhile enterprise. And then being able to have high standards of animal welfare with no mulesing with the animals, their health indicating that they're not having any problems with loose manure and not having any problems in attracting flies and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it's been a really interesting and wonderful journey for us, and just wanted to talk about that today, and thank you very much.